August 15, 1945. Tokyo. The war was over, but Japan did not know what it was about to become. The emperor had spoken. The surrender was announced. Radios crackled across a nation already burned, starved, and shattered. Millions believed the worst had passed. They were wrong, because what followed was not liberation, it was occupation. And in another version of history, one that almost happened, it never ended. American warships filled Tokyo Bay like steel continents. B-29 bombers still circled overhead, not to bomb, but to remind. Marines landed not as guests, but as owners. Every port, every rail line, every radio tower, every ministry building. This was not conquest by chaos. This was conquest by design. The United States had emerged from World War II richer, stronger, and more industrially powerful than any empire in human history. Its factories had not been bombed, its cities had not burned, its population had grown fat on wartime production while the rest of the world starved. Japan was now defenseless. And inside Washington, a question was quietly asked. What if we never leave? Most people today believe the U.S. occupation of Japan was always meant to be temporary. 7 years, a rebuilding phase, a peaceful transition. That is the story taught in textbooks. But buried beneath that version is another reality. Early post-war planning documents, internal military debates, and classified policy drafts reveal something far darker. There were voices, serious, powerful voices, who believed Japan should remain under American control for decades, not as an ally, not as a partner, but as a permanent military state, a forward base, a controlled society, an unsinkable aircraft carrier in Asia. And history came far closer to that outcome than most people will ever realize. Before we go deeper, let me ask you something. If you're holding your phone right now or watching this on your screen, have you subscribed yet? If you haven't, do it now. Subscribe to World War II Dark Secrets. September 1945. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers Headquarters, Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur ruled Japan like a modern shogun. His authority was absolute. No Japanese law existed without his approval. No political decision was made without American consent. The emperor himself, once considered divine, now bowed quietly beneath U.S. oversight. On paper, Japan was sovereign. In reality, it was occupied territory. American troops controlled everything that mattered. Food distribution, media censorship, education systems, police restructuring, industrial output. Nothing moved without American permission. And from the very beginning, some planners argued this should never change. Japan, they said, could not be trusted. Not after Pearl Harbor, not after Nanking, not after kamikaze pilots flew willingly into steel. The fear was simple. If America leaves, Japan will rise again. Inside the Pentagon, strategic planners viewed Japan not as a defeated nation, but as a geographic weapon. Its location was too valuable, its ports too perfect, its proximity to China and the Soviet Far East too dangerous to abandon. The Pacific War had taught the U.S. one lesson above all others: control the islands, control the ocean, control the future. Japan sat at the center of that equation. By late 1945, internal memos began circulating with language never intended for public eyes. They did not speak of reconstruction. They spoke of long-term stability through sustained presence. Years were mentioned, then decades. Some drafts avoided numbers entirely. Indefinite administration. The justification was always framed as protection. Protection from militarism, protection from communism, protection from itself. But behind closed doors, the real motive was power.
The United States now possessed unmatched naval reach, atomic weapons, industrial output that dwarfed every other nation combined. Japan was the perfect platform from which to project that power permanently into Asia. If the occupation never ended, the U.S. would control Pacific trade routes forever. Soviet expansion could be contained before it began. China's future could be shaped or strangled, and Japan would never again act without American approval. For many officials, this was not tyranny, it was common sense. Early occupation policy deliberately dismantled Japanese self-rule. Political parties were allowed only under supervision. Newspapers were censored. Even language was monitored. Words associated with nationalism quietly vanished from public discourse. Children were taught new textbooks written under American guidance. History was rewritten, the war reframed, the emperor transformed into a symbol. This was social engineering on a national scale, and it worked, which raised a dangerous question. If control was this easy, why give it up? By 1946, tensions with the Soviet Union were rising fast. The Cold War was already forming in the shadows. American generals feared that a fully independent Japan might drift, one day, towards neutrality, or worse, towards Moscow. A permanent occupation solved that problem forever. Some advisors proposed a rotating governance model. Japanese officials would administer the country, but real authority would remain American. Military bases would expand, not shrink. Constitutional limitations would lock Japan into dependence. The Japanese people would live normal lives, but the state itself would never be free. Behind the language of peace was an iron reality. Japan would become a managed nation. And there was precedent. The United States had already done it elsewhere. Territories, protectorates, puppet governments disguised as republics. The model was familiar. The difference was scale. Japan was not small. Japan was strategic gold. Yet this path carried a risk few were willing to say aloud. An occupation without end would require control without consent. And control without consent always breeds resistance. By 1947, whispers of unrest began to surface. Former soldiers struggled with humiliation. National pride collapsed into quiet resentment. Black markets flourished beneath American oversight. The population complied, but it did not forget. Inside American intelligence reports, one phrase appeared again and again: passive hostility. The Japanese bowed, they smiled, they obeyed, but underneath, something hardened. American planners now faced a choice that would define the century: leave and risk Japan's return as an independent power, or stay and rule a nation that never asked to be ruled. If the decision tilted even slightly the other way, Japan's future and Asia's would have been unrecognizable. And the next phase would not be peaceful, it would be permanent.
Washington, D.C. By the time most Americans stopped paying attention to Japan, the argument over its future had already turned brutal. The war was over. Soldiers were coming home. The public wanted normal life back. But inside the Pentagon and the State Department, Japan was no longer a defeated enemy. It was a chess piece. The Soviet Union was tightening its grip on Eastern Europe. China was collapsing into civil war. Communist movements were spreading across Asia like fire through dry grass. And Japan sat directly in the middle. To many U.S. strategists, withdrawing from Japan now felt reckless. Leaving meant uncertainty. Staying meant control. And America, in 1948, had grown accustomed to control. General MacArthur publicly spoke of democracy and peace. Privately, his headquarters produced reports that read more like occupation manuals than exit strategies. Infrastructure plans assumed decades of American oversight. Military base expansions were drawn up without end dates.
Okinawa, already seized, was transformed into a fortress. Runways multiplied, naval facilities deepened, entire villages were relocated to make room for American hardware. This was not temporary behavior. This was long-term positioning. Some planners openly compared Japan to Germany after World War I. Leave too soon, they warned, and resentment would ferment, leave power in Japanese hands, and one day it would be used against American interests. Their solution was elegant in its cruelty. Let Japan exist, but never fully decide. The Japanese government would operate, but only within boundaries written in Washington. Defense would remain forbidden. Foreign policy would be guided quietly. Economic recovery would be steered towards dependence on U.S. trade. Japan would prosper, but only under supervision. This model had a name inside classified circles: managed sovereignty. It was occupation without the word occupation. In this alternate path, the peace treaty never fully materialized. Negotiations dragged, new conditions were added, security concerns delayed independence again and again. Each delay was justified. The Korean peninsula was unstable. China had fallen to Mao. The Soviets tested their own atomic bomb. Every crisis became another excuse to stay. By the early 1950s, American troop numbers in Japan stabilized instead of shrinking. Bases expanded into permanent cities. Entire generations of U.S. servicemen rotated through Japan without ever knowing a time when it was not under American command. Japanese children grew up seeing American uniforms as part of daily life. English became a second language, not by choice, but by necessity. Jobs flowed through U.S.-linked industries. Media remained quietly filtered. Political leaders learned quickly which opinions ended careers. Resistance did not come in explosions. It came in silence. Former imperial officers disappeared into obscurity. Nationalist groups formed underground, monitored closely by U.S. intelligence. Any hint of organized opposition was crushed economically before it could grow physically. Licenses revoked, funding cut, careers ended. Japanese people adapted because survival demanded it, but adaptation is not loyalty. Inside CIA psychological profiles, analysts warned of a dangerous trend. Japan was becoming outwardly compliant, but inwardly fractured. Cultural pride stripped too fast did not vanish, it fossilized, and fossils can shatter. Meanwhile, America benefited enormously. Japan became a logistics hub unmatched in Asia. U.S. fleets could reach anywhere in the Pacific within days. Supply chains flowed uninterrupted. American corporations dominated reconstruction contracts, factories, shipping, electronics. The wealth generated was staggering. Japan rebuilt fast, not as an independent miracle, but as an extension of American economic power. The rising prosperity masked the loss of autonomy. Streets were clean, shelves were full, but decisions were not Japanese. They were approved. As the Cold War intensified, voices calling for permanent occupation grew louder, not quieter. Japan, they argued, was proof that American governance worked. Crime dropped, industry boomed, communism failed to take root. Why risk undoing success? Why gamble on freedom when control delivered stability? By the late 1950s, a new generation of American policymakers never knew a world without occupied Japan. To them, it was normal, a solved problem, a permanent base. But permanence has a cost. Young Japanese men, born after the war, began asking questions their parents were too afraid to voice. Why did American soldiers have immunity? Why did Japanese courts not try certain crimes? Why did foreign bases occupy ancestral land? Student movements emerged, small at first, watched closely. Protests were allowed, but only to a point. And every time unrest surfaced, Washington faced the same dilemma: concede authority or tighten the grip. In this version of history, the grip tightened, because by now, leaving Japan would not look like generosity, it would look like retreat. And America, at the height of its power, did not retreat. The occupation had crossed a threshold. Japan was no longer being rebuilt, it was being owned. And the longer it lasted, the more dangerous the exit became, because empires don't fall when they arrive, they fall when they try to leave. And Japan was approaching the moment where obedience would no longer be enough.
1962, Tokyo. 17 years had passed since surrender, and the occupation had quietly transformed into something no one publicly named: a permanent reality. American flags still flew over military compounds across the country. Bases had grown into fortified cities, complete with schools, hospitals, airfields, and ports that answered not to Tokyo, but to Washington. Entire coastlines were effectively off-limits to Japanese authority. To the outside world, Japan looked stable, prosperous, rebuilt. Inside, it was suffocating. A generation had grown up never knowing true sovereignty. They had not lost a war, they had inherited a leash. And they were no longer willing to accept it. University campuses became the pressure points. Students studied Western philosophy, American ideals, and democratic theory, then compared them to their own reality. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Freedom was preached, control was practiced. Protests erupted first in words, then in numbers. Demonstrations filled streets near U.S. bases. Signs demanded dignity, autonomy, an end to foreign immunity. Riot police responded swiftly, trained and advised by American security forces. The message was clear: you may speak, but not too loudly, and never effectively. Washington dismissed the unrest as manageable. Intelligence briefings labeled it youth agitation. Analysts predicted it would burn out. They were wrong. By the mid-1960s, resentment spread beyond students. Labor unions joined. Intellectuals followed. Former soldiers, now old enough to stop fearing consequences, began to talk. Not of revenge, of identity. Japan, they said, had become a shadow nation. Wealthy, yes. Safe, yes, but hollow. Its constitution forbade defense. Its leaders deferred to foreign approval. Its culture survived, but its will had been anesthetized. And nothing enrages a people more than being told their chains are for their own good. American intelligence reports grew darker. Recruitment for underground nationalist groups increased. Sabotage incidents around bases rose quietly, rarely reported. Small fires, equipment damage, anonymous threats. The occupation had crossed another invisible line. Control now required force. U.S. commanders faced a nightmare scenario they had long dismissed. What if Japan resisted not with war, but with refusal? Strikes disrupted ports used by American fleets. Rail workers slowed logistics. Civil servants leaked documents. Courts delayed cases involving U.S. personnel. Every action was legal. Every action was devastating. Japan was using bureaucracy as a weapon. Washington responded the only way empires ever do, with pressure. Economic leverage tightened. Political leaders sympathetic to independence found funding disappear. Media outlets critical of the occupation faced regulatory scrutiny. Intelligence agencies quietly expanded surveillance programs. Japan became one of the most monitored societies on Earth. Not by enemies, by its overseer. And still, the resistance grew. By the early 1970s, the world had changed. Vietnam exposed the limits of American power. Television broadcast images Washington could no longer control. Global opinion shifted. Suddenly, permanent occupation no longer looked like stability. It looked like hypocrisy. Allies questioned it. Rivals exploited it.
The Soviet Union framed Japan as proof that American liberation was just colonialism with better branding. Inside Japan, the pressure reached a breaking point. A massive protest erupted near Yokosuka Naval Base. Hundreds of thousands filled the streets, not chanting, standing, silent. American commanders panicked. Silence could not be dispersed. There were no slogans to ban, no leaders to arrest. The world watched, and for the first time in decades, Washington hesitated. Leaving now meant admitting the occupation had gone too far. Staying meant risking open rebellion in one of the most industrialized nations on Earth. Either choice carried consequences that could echo for generations. Some advisors proposed gradual withdrawal. Others warned that any concession would unleash chaos. Hardliners argued Japan had benefited enormously and owed compliance. The argument turned bitter, because beneath it was an unspoken truth. America no longer knew how to let go. The occupation had reshaped both nations. Japan had grown dependent. America had grown entitled. What began as post-war security had hardened into ownership. And ownership always invites resistance. By the late 1970s, something unprecedented happened. Japanese officials publicly questioned the legitimacy of indefinite occupation on the world stage, not angrily, calmly, legally, in international forums. It was a challenge Washington could not silence. The occupation reached its final phase, not collapse, exposure, and once exposed, power behaves differently. The last part of this story is not about violence, it's about consequences. Because the greatest damage of a 50-year occupation would not be visible in ruins or blood. It would be visible in what Japan and America became after it ended.
1995, Tokyo. 50 years had passed since the war ended, and in this version of history, the occupation finally did too. Not with a ceremony, not with celebration, but with exhaustion. The decision came quietly from Washington, buried under layers of diplomatic language. A new world had emerged. The Soviet Union was gone. China had risen. America's attention was fractured. Maintaining absolute control over Japan no longer delivered the same strategic return. So the United States did what empires always do when the cost outweighs the benefit. It reframed the story. Official statements called it a transition, a natural evolution, a mutual agreement between partners. History was rewritten in real time to soften the truth. This was not generosity. It was retreat disguised as maturity. The occupation authorities dismantled themselves piece by piece. Laws were amended, jurisdictions slowly returned, military immunity was revised, not erased. Bases remained, but their presence was rebranded as cooperative, not commanding. Japan was finally sovereign. On paper. But half a century of control leaves scars that do not disappear with signatures. Japan emerged wealthy, advanced, disciplined, and deeply cautious. Its political culture had learned obedience too well. Leaders hesitated to act without external validation. Military restraint, once imposed, became psychological. The constitution that forbade war was no longer just a document. It was a reflex. Japan's economy had thrived, but its strategic instincts had atrophied. Innovation flourished in technology, not in power. Influence was exercised quietly, through trade and finance, never through force. The nation had survived by adapting. But adaptation is not the same as freedom. For the Japanese people, independence arrived like an unfamiliar language. Younger generations felt relief. Older ones felt confusion. Some felt anger that it had taken so long. Others feared what would come next without an overseer. Identities suppressed for decades returned in fragments. National pride resurfaced cautiously, cultural confidence rebuilt slowly,
but the memory of occupation lingered in habits, in institutions, in unspoken limits. Japan had not been destroyed, it had been reshaped, and reshaping has consequences. For the United States, the cost was different, but no less severe. 50 years of ruling another advanced nation altered America's self-image. It normalized intervention. It blurred the line between security and control. Generations of policymakers grew up believing stability could be enforced indefinitely if the resources were sufficient. Japan became the proof case. The example cited whenever occupation was proposed elsewhere. It worked there, they said, ignoring the resentment, ignoring the silence, ignoring the long-term damage. By the time the occupation ended, America no longer saw itself only as a republic. It saw itself as a manager of world order. That belief shaped future wars, future interventions, future overreach. And when those later occupations failed, violently, publicly, the contrast was brutal. Japan complied, others did not. The difference was never culture, it was context. Japan had been broken completely before it was rebuilt. Its cities burned, its military erased, its emperor humbled. It had no leverage left, and America had all of it. That imbalance made control possible, but also deceptive. It convinced Washington that power alone could engineer societies. The world learned otherwise. Looking back, historians in this alternate timeline reached a harsh conclusion. A 50-year occupation did not create a stronger Japan. It created a safer one, and safety came at the price of sovereignty. It did not create a wiser America. It created a more confident one, and confidence came at the price of humility. Japan never rebelled openly. America never admitted dominance openly. Both paid quietly. Today, the Pacific remains shaped by that half-century. Alliances built on dependency, bases justified by history, trust mixed with caution. The relationship between the two nations is stable but asymmetrical, friendly but unequal, and beneath it all lies an uncomfortable question. If the United States had truly believed in freedom, why did it take 50 years to let Japan choose its own future? Because the darkest truth of power is not cruelty, it is reluctance to let go. This version of history never happened, but it almost did, and that alone should make us uneasy, because it proves one thing beyond doubt. The end of war does not end domination. Sometimes it only perfects it.